Throughout history, various methods of musical instrument classification have been used. The most commonly used system in use in the West today divides instruments into string instruments, woodwind instruments, brass instruments and percussion instruments. However, other ones have been devised, and other cultures use varying methods. Chinese classification. The oldest known scheme of classifying instruments is Chinese and dates from the 3rd millennium BC. It groups instruments according to what they are made out of. All instruments made out of stone are in one group, all those made out of wood in another, those made out of silk are in a third, and all those made of bamboo in the fourth, as recorded in the Youqi, compiled from sources of the Chou period, and corresponding to the 4 seasons and 4 winds. The eightfold system of Pa Yin, from the same source, occurred gradually, and in the legendary Emperor Shun's time it is believed to have been presented in the following order: metal, stone, silk, bamboo, wood, clay, leather, and wood classes, and it correlated to the 8 seasons and 8 winds of Chinese culture: autumn and west, autumn-winter and NW, summer and south, spring and east, winter-spring and NE, summer-autumn and SW, winter and north, and spring-summer and SE, respectively. However, the Chu Li, an anonymous treatise compiled from earlier sources in about the 2nd century BC, had the following order: metal, stone, clay, leather, silk, wood, and bamboo. The same order was presented in the Tzu-Chuan, attributed to Tzu Chilming, probably compiled in the 4th century BC. Much later, Ming dynasty scholar Chu Tzu recognized 3 groups: those instruments using muscle power or used for musical accompaniment, those that are blown, and those that are rhythmic, a scheme which was probably the first of scholarly type, the other earlier ones being traditional, folk taxonomies. More usually, instruments are classified according to how the sound is initially produced. Western classification, the system used in the West today, dividing instruments into wind, strings, and percussion, is of Greek origin. The scheme was later expanded by Martin Agricola, who distinguished plucked string instruments, such as guitars, from bowed string instruments, such as violins. Classical musicians today do not always maintain this division, but there is a distinction made between wind instruments with a reed and wind instruments where the air is set in motion directly by the lips. There are, however, problems with this system. Some rarely seen and non-Western instruments do not fit very neatly into it. The serpent, for example, an old instrument rarely seen nowadays, ought to be classified as a brass instrument, as a column of air is set in motion by the lips. However, it looks more like a woodwind instrument, and is closer to one in many ways, having finger holes to control pitch, rather than valves. There are also problems with classifying certain keyboard instruments. For example, the piano has strings, but they are struck by hammers, so it is not clear whether it should be classified as a string instrument or a percussion instrument. For this reason, keyboard instruments are often regarded as inhabiting a category of their own, including all instruments played by a keyboard, whether they have struck strings, plucked strings or no strings at all. It might be said that with these extra categories, the classical system of instrument classification focuses less on the fundamental way in which instruments produce sound, and more on the technique required to play them. Various names have been assigned to these 3 traditional Western groupings. Boethius labeled them intention ad nervis, spiritu ut tibiae, and percussion. Cassiodorus, a younger contemporary of the above, used the names tensibilia, percussionalia, and inflatilia. Roger Bacon dubbed them tensilia, inflativa, and percussionalia. Ugolino da Orvieto called them intention ad nervis, spiritu ut tibiae, and percussion. Sebastian de Brossard referred to them as encada orientata, pneumatica or impneosta, and crusta or pulsatilia. Filippo Bonanni used vernacular names, sonori per il fiato, sonori per la tension, and sonori per la percussion. Joseph Major called them pneumatica, pulsatilia, and fidicina. Johann Eisel dubbed them pneumatica, pulsatilia, and fidicina. Johannes de Muris used the terms cordalia, foraminalia, and versalia. Regino of Prum called them tensible, inflatile, and percussionabile. Turkish encyclopedist Adi Khalifa also recognized the same three classes in his Kashf al-Zunan and Asami al-Kutub wa Funun, a treatise on the origin and construction of musical instruments. But this was exceptional for Near Eastern writers, as they mostly ignored the percussion group, as did early Hellenistic Greeks, the Near Eastern culture traditionally in that period of Greek history having low regard for that group. The Tabali of Mindanao use the same three categories as well, but group the strings with the winds together based on a gentleness-strength dichotomy, regarding the percussion group as strong and the wind strings group as gentle. The division pervades Tabali thought about cosmology, social characters of men and women, and artistic styles. Millennium and Hornbostel-Sachs systems, an ancient system of Indian origin, dating from the 4th or 3rd century BC, in the Natya Shastra, a theoretical treatise on music and dramaturgy, by Bharata Muni, divides instruments into four main classification groups: instruments where the sound is produced by vibrating strings, instruments where the sound is produced by vibrating columns of air, percussion instruments made of wood or metal, and percussion instruments with skin heads, or drums. Victor Charles Moulin later adopted a system very similar to this. He was the curator of the musical instrument collection of the Conservatoire in Brussels, and for the 1888 catalogue of the collection divided instruments into four groups: strings, winds, drums, and other percussion. This scheme was later taken up by Erich von Hornbostel and Kurt Sachs, who published an extensive new scheme for classification in Zeitschrift für Kunsthistorische Ethnologie in 1914. Their scheme is widely used today, and is most often known as the Hornbostel-Sachs system. The original Sachs-Hornbostel system classified instruments into four main groups: idiophones, such as the xylophone, which produce sound by vibrating themselves; membranophones, such as drums or kazoos, which produce sound by a vibrating membrane; chordophones, such as the piano or cello, which produce sound by vibrating strings; aerophones, such as the pipe organ or oboe, which produce sound by vibrating columns of air. Later Sachs added a fifth category, electrophones, such as theremins, which produce sound by electronic means. Modern synthesizers and electronic instruments fall in this category. Within each category are many subgroups. The system has been criticized and revised over the years, but remains widely used by ethnomusicologists and organologists. Andrew Copyright Schäffer, in 1932, comparative musicologist Andrew Copyright Schäffer developed a new classification scheme that was exhaustive, potentially covering all real and conceivable instruments. Schäffer's system has only two top-level categories, which he denoted by Roman numerals: I, instruments that make sound from vibrating solids; IA, no tension; IB, linguophones, solid fixed at only one end, such as a kalimba or thumb piano; IC, chordophones; plus drums. 2. Instruments that make sound from vibrating air. The system agrees with Millennium and Hornbostel-Sachs for chordophones, but groups percussion instruments differently. 2nd century Greek grammarian, sophist, and rhetorician Julius Pollux, in the chapter called De Musica, in his 10-volume Onomasticon, had presented the two-class system, percussion and winds, which persisted in medieval and post-medieval Europe. It was used by St. Augustine, in his De Ordine, applying the terms rhythmic, organic, and adding harmonic. Isidore of Seville. Hugh of St. Victor, also adding the voice. Magister Lambertus, adding the human voice as well. And Michael Pretorius, Kartomi, 1990, ppA 119 Euro 21, 147. The KPELLE of West Africa also use this system. They distinguished the struck, including both beaten and plucked, and the blown, as revealed by Ruth Stone in Let the Inside Be Sweet, The Interpretation of Music Among the KPELLE of Liberia, 1982, Indiana U Press. The Yilla group is subdivided into 5 categories: instruments possessing lamellas, those possessing strings, those possessing a membrane, hollow wooden, iron, or bottle containers, and various rattles and bells. The Hausa, also of West Africa, Classify drummers into those who beat drums and those who beat strings, as reported by Ames and King in Glossary of Hausa Music and its Social Contexts, 1971, Northwestern U Press. Kartomi does not specify if these two classifications predate Schäffer or Pollux. The concept, the way the person produces the sound, is human-centered, which is part of their traditional culture, so presumably they at least predate Schäffer. The MSA Arena copyright Lysolov and Jim Matson, using 37 variables, including characteristics of the sounding body, resonator, substructure, sympathetic vibrator, performance context, social context, and instrument tuning and construction, corroborated the taxonomy of Schäffer, producing two categories, aerophones and the chordophone-membranophone-idiophone combination. Another similar system is the five-class, physics-based organology, which was presented in 2007 by Steve Mann, comprises gaeophones, hydralophones, aerophones, plasmaphones, and quintephones, the names referring to the five essences, being earth, water, wind, fire, and the quintessence, thus adding three new categories to the Schäffer taxonomy. Classifying instruments by range, Western instruments are also often classified by their musical range in comparison with other instruments in the same family. These terms are named after singing voice classifications: soprano instruments, flute, clarinet, recorder, violin, trumpet, oboe, soprano saxophone, alto instruments, alto flute, viola, French horn, alto saxophone, tenor instruments, English horn, trombone, tenor saxophone, baritone instruments, cello, baritone horn, bass clarinet, bassoon, baritone saxophone, bass instruments, double bass, tuba, bass saxophone. Some instruments fall into more than one category. For example, the cello may be considered either tenor or bass, depending on how its music fits into the ensemble, and the trombone may be alto, tenor, or bass, and the French horn, bass, baritone, tenor, or alto, depending on which range it is played. Many instruments have their range as part of their name: soprano saxophone, alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone, baritone horn, alto flute, bass flute, alto recorder, bass guitar, etc. Additional adjectives describe instruments above the soprano range or below the bass, for example, soprano saxophone, contrabass clarinet. When used in the name of an instrument, these terms are relative, describing the instrument's range in comparison to other instruments of its family and not in comparison to the human voice range or instruments of other families. For example, a bass flute's range is from C3 to Fa unregistered trademark 6, while a bass clarinet plays about one octave lower. Other classifications: sometimes instruments are classified according to the materials from which they are made. For example, percussion instruments made from metal are sometimes called metallophones, while those made of stone are called lithophones. This idea is not limited to Western practice. The ancient Chinese categorized instruments into 8 categories of materials. Sometimes instruments are classed according to the method of their construction rather than their materials. For example, lamellophones are instruments that produced sound by the plucking of their lamellae, or tongues are Euro strips of metal, wood, or bamboo fixed to a soundboard or resonator. In the Hornbostel-Sachs classification of musical instruments, lamellophones are considered plucked idiophones, a category that includes various forms of jaw harp and the European mechanical music box, as well as the huge variety of African and Afro-Latin thumb pianos such as the mara and marimbula. Sometimes instruments are categorized according to a common use, such as signal instruments, a category which may include instruments and very different Hornbostel-Sachs categories such as trumpets, drums, and gongs. According to social function may be in this category or a separate one, but an example based on this criterion is Bononi, Kartomi, 1990. He also classified them according to geography and whether they were past or present. Benjamin de Laborde classified them according to ethnicity, his categories being Black, Abyssinian, Chinese, Arabic, Turkish, and Greek. Instruments can also be classified according to the ensemble in which they play, or the role they play in the ensemble. For example, the horn section in popular music typically includes both brass instruments and woodwind instruments. The symphony orchestra typically has the strings in the front, the woodwinds in the middle, and the basses, brass, and percussion in the back. Major classifications done for the Indonesian ensemble, the gamelan, have been done by Jaap Kunst, Matapangrawit, Pubapangrawit, and Sumarsum. Kunst's taxonomy has 5 categories: nuclear theme in Indonesian, colotomic, interpunctuating, the gongs, countermelodic, paraphrasing, subdivided as close to the nuclear theme and ornamental filling, agogic, drums. Matapangrawit has 2 categories, irama and lagu, the former corresponds to Kunst's classes 2 and 5, and the latter to Kunst's 1, 3, and 4. Pubapangrawit, similar to Kunst's, derives 6 categories: balangan, the saran, demung, and slentham. Wirangan, the gender, gambang, and boning. Elitan, rebab and male chorus. Singitan, kembang, flute and female voice. Jejjingwarama, drums. Samusam scheme comprises an inner melodic group, with a wide range, divided as elaborating, gambang, pesandan, selempung, suling. Mediating, saran painrus, a loud metallophone. And abstracting, with a 1-octave range, loud and soft metallophones. An outer circle, the structural group, which underlines the structure of the work. And occupying the space outside the outer circle, the kendang, a tempo-regulating group. The gamelan is also divided into front, middle, and back, much like the symphony orchestra. In West Africa, tribes such as the Dan, Jio, Kpelle, Hausa, Akan, and Ogun, use a uniquely human-centered system. It derives from 4 myth-based parameters: the musical instrument's non-human owner, the mode of transmission to the human realm, the making of the instrument by a human, and the first human owner. Most instruments are said to have a non-human origin, but some are believed invented by humans. For example, the xylophone and the lamellophone. An orally transmitted Javanese taxonomy has 8 groupings: Brakikan Dijaga, Brakikan Devuthik and gong chimes, Brakikan Dikbuk, Brakikan Depethic, Brakikan Descendal, Brakikan Dikasok, Brakikan Diceball, Brakikan Dikasok. A Javanese classification transmitted in literary form is as follows: Brakikan Pranuwesi, Brakikan Kulit, Brakikan Kewu, Brakikan Kawattali, Brakikan Bamboo Pring. This is much like the Pa Yin. It is suspected of being old, but its age is unknown. Minangkabau musicians use the following taxonomy for Bunyi Bunyian, Dipukua, Dipapik, Dipatik, Ditarik, Digisik, Dipusiang. The last one is for the Bulrora. They also distinguish instruments on the basis of origin because of socio-historical contacts, and recognize 3 categories: Minangkabau, Arabic, and Western, each of these divided up according to the 5 categories. Classifying musical instruments on the basis socio-historical factors as well as mode of sound production is common in Indonesia. The Batak of North Sumatra recognize the following classes: beaten, blown, bowed, and plucked instruments, but their primary classification is of ensembles. In 1960, German musicologist Kurt Reinhardt presented a stylistic taxonomy, as opposed to a morphological one, with 2 divisions determined by either single or multiple voiced playing. Each of these 2 divisions was subdivided according to pitch changeability, and also by tonal continuity and continuous, the friction instruments and the winds, making 12 categories. He also proposed classification according to whether or not they had dynamic tonal variability, a characteristic that separates whole eras, as in the transition from the terrace dynamics of the harpsichord to the crescendo of the piano, grading by degree of absolute loudness, timbral spectra, tunability, and degree of resonance. Al-Farabi, Arab scholar of the 10th century, also distinguished tonal duration. In one of his 4 schemes, in his 2-volume Kitab al-Musiki al-Kabir, he identified 5 classes, in order of ranking: as follows: the human voice, the bowed strings and winds, plucked strings, percussion, and dance. The march first pointed out as having continuous tone. Ibn Sina, Persian scholar of the 11th century, presented the scheme in his Kitab al-Najat, making the same distinction, having two classes. In his Kitab al-Schäffer, he proposed another taxonomy, this one having 5 classes: fretted instruments, unfretted stringed, lyres and harps, bowed stringed, wind, other wind instruments such as the organ, and the stick-struck psalter. The distinction between fretted and open was in classic Arab fashion. See also, organology, Hornbostel-Sachs, category, Hornbostel-Sachs, list of musical instruments, classification of percussion instruments, musical instruments, signal instrument, references.